Good afternoon, attendees of the American Public University System Symposium. My name is Clarissa Hamilton, and I am an undergraduate student of the Environmental Science program. Today I would like to discuss Rachel Carson's work, Silent Spring, and how current science relates to the themes of this book. In this session, I will begin by providing a bit of background on Rachel Carson as well as the major themes discussed in Silent Spring. We are going to discuss the influence this work has had on the public as well as the criticisms of the book. Finally, I will be discussing current research and how it has held up against the claims made in Silent Spring, as well as what the future may hold on the topic. Rachel Carson was a remarkable woman who came from very humble beginnings. In the introduction of Silent Spring, Linda Lear provides some valuable insights into who Rachel Carson was. She received her undergraduate degree in biology from the Pennsylvania College for Women and continued her studies at Woods Hole Biological Laboratory and Johns Hopkins University, where she obtained a master's degree in zoology. Her professional career began by writing nature articles for various publications before becoming a junior aquatic biologist for the Bureau of Fisheries in Baltimore. Eventually, she became editor-in-chief for publications for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. After becoming a successful author, she began to focus on pesticides and some of the worrying trends she was noticing. She wrote Silent Spring in order to get her message out to the public. One can assume that Rachel Carson hoped her work would have an impact, but she likely never imagined just how significant and long-lasting this impact would be. She faced an uphill battle against those who disagreed with her work. Unfortunately, the battle that Rachel Carson lost was to cancer in 1964, but her legacy would live on. Silent Spring was published in 1962 during the height of the Cold War and after pesticide usage had become more mainstream after the conclusion of World War II. The book discusses the usage of chlorinated hydrocarbons and organic phosphates as synthetic chemicals for pesticides. Carson highlights information that may not have been well known to the public at that time with regards to the safety of these chemicals and their potential impacts. She discusses this information while urging individuals to begin asking questions to understand the full picture before blindly utilizing the pesticides and relying on the safety assurance provided by those with stake in the use of pesticides. Throughout the book, Rachel Carson discusses the in-depth information on the chemicals themselves, as well as their ability to bioaccumulate in the tissues of organisms and the biomagnification that occurs as you move up through trophic levels, indicating both the direct and indirect impact of them. In addition, she discusses the soil contamination caused by pesticide usage, to include the ability of these synthetic chemicals to persist in soil for significant amounts of time. Through direct spraying over water sources as well as runoff from agricultural areas, water contamination also occurs, impacting aquatic life. She also brings to light the economic concerns of utilizing pesticides as target species build up resistance, causing the need for increased sprayings and the redesign of new synthetic chemicals. Overall, Carson's main point is that we should have to take into consideration the ethical impacts of our actions. She outlines that we must fully understand the impacts that synthetic chemicals have on living organisms and the environment before their widespread use by way of scientific research and observation. She does not assert that all pesticide usage should be banned, but instead asks valid questions while reminding readers of the essential butterfly effect these chemicals may be having on our environment and therefore our future. As I mentioned earlier, I do not believe that there was any way Rachel Carson could have foreseen the impact that her work would have. This timeline, built based upon information from the Environmental Protection Agency, outlines significant milestones in our environmental history after the publishing of Silent Spring. Included here are other negative environmental events as well as legislation that has been passed in order to protect the environment and preserve it as best as we can for the future. In 1972, not long after the publishing of Silent Spring, the use of DDT was banned in the United States. Further down the line are legislation efforts to help remediate the damaged environment, as well as further bans and regulations imposed on pesticides. Many have said that Rachel Carson was a large part of the catalyst for an environmental revolution. She achieved this by speaking about the issues in terms that the general public could understand and encourage them to ask questions and not blindly accept the actions being taken. I briefly discussed earlier that Rachel Carson and her work did not go without criticism. In 2017, Mark Hamilton Little published an article discussing the criticisms against Rachel Carson. At the time of Silent Springs publishing, those who opposed what Rachel Carson had to say took one of three roads to cast doubt on her. The first was attempts made to discredit her. Some of her critics did not hold her in high regards because she was a woman during this time, and an unmarried woman at that. In addition, they felt that she was not educated enough and did not hold high enough standing in the scientific community to be making the assertions that she was making. Secondly, there was significant diversion of her message. Scientists, political, and industry leaders alike continued to push their narrow safety message they had been sending, choosing once again to not dig further into the issues that, as Rachel Carson had urged. Some even claimed that Carson was on a quote-unquote green crusade to stop progress being made. Finally, her critics placed a lot of ethical blame on her for what they claimed would happen if pesticide usage stopped, particularly with regards to malaria and other insect-borne diseases that claim human lives. Some critics even went as far as to say that the lives lost would be on her hand. Rachel Carson never let these criticisms get to her, and she continued to push for what she thought was right and necessary, not just for her, but for all life. Today's science has given a lot of credence to what Rachel Carson had to say in 1962. During my research, it became clear to me that Rachel Carson's claims of bioaccumulation, biomagnification, chemical persistence in the soil, water contamination, and impacts on aquatic life had been proven. In the last 5 years of research I reviewed, many scientists are embarking on new research in order to better understand the far-reaching impacts of synthetic chemicals, as well as reviewing previous scientific research in order to determine better ways to mitigate and forecast impacts. To begin, in 2020, Goncalves et al. Published a review of current research looking into the bioaccumulation and biomagnification of pesticides in tissues. Their review concentrated primarily on freshwater aquatic organisms of zooplankton, macroinvertebrates, and fish, and discussed the successful usage of fatty acids to determine bioaccumulation and biomagnification impacts, as the pesticides disturb both pathological and biochemical processes within the organisms. The authors ultimately conclude in their review that fatty acid content may be utilized as a biomarker to show exposure. Through their review, they discuss a great deal on biomagnification as they move through the trophic levels from zooplankton to fish, which echoes Rachel Carson's assertions. Next, research conducted by Aslam et al. That was published in 2018 dealt with the persistence of pesticides in soil. As the authors discussed in their work, it has long been known that synthetic chemicals have significant longevity within soils. What the authors did was work to create a new type of model that combines features from previous models to determine the persistence of synthetic chemicals in soil when plant residue mulch has been applied to cover the soil. The authors conducted laboratory simulations with both frequent light rain conditions and infrequent heavy rain conditions. The information obtained from these simulations was utilized to determine the accuracy of the model. Overall, the authors found the results of their work to be satisfactory in determining pesticide transmission and longevity in soil columns, and found that the predictability of this is pesticide dependent. This type of research could be very beneficial in determining which pesticides to utilize in agricultural activities. Current research is also looking into long-term pesticide impacts on humans. Rachel Carson asserted in her book that pesticides could impact children immediately upon birth, if not before. In 2019, Kochmansky et al. Conducted a laboratory experiment on mice by exposing them to dieldrin, one of the chemicals discussed at length by Rachel Carson. The experiment looked at a couple of different things. First, pregnant mice were given consistent dosages of dieldrin to determine if the pesticide could be passed directly to the unborn mice. When the tissues of the baby mice were examined, it was found that they did indeed contain concentrations of dieldrin. This is significantly eye-opening, which leads to the second portion of the study. The authors proposed that the exposures to chemicals such as dieldrin may impact the likelihood of late-life neurological diseases such as Parkinson's disease. For this portion of the experiment, Kochmansky et al. Provided adult mice with consistent amounts of dieldrin and compared the DNA methylation of the midbrain to that to that of a control group. Both males and females were looked at separately in this study. The study appears to show greater impacts to female mice over male mice. The study was unable to show clear connection to developmental exposures of dieldrin and late-life neurological diseases, but it did conclude that the timing of exposure during development is critical. Overall, further research on this subject and further experimentation will need to be done in order to come to any full conclusions. The final study that I looked into dealt with looking into alternatives for synthetic pesticides. Rachel Carson discussed the natural ecological order of things and how quite often natural predatory species of insects or other creatures does better at controlling problem insects than synthetic pesticide usage. A 2019 review was conducted by Dominguez and Santos looking into the effectiveness of the pennyroyal essential oil as a type of biocide. The review concentrated on recent research of the essential oil on microorganisms, animals including insects, parasites, and nematodes, as well as on plants. The authors found that the oil is promising as a biocide due to its toxicity across a wide variety of species and its ability to leave the crops undamaged. The authors cautioned that it should be utilized with caution under the lowest effective dosages and also discussed the need for further tests on its effects on non-target species. Overall, all current research that I found supports the main themes of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring while diving much deeper into the issues at hand. All the research previously discussed shows significant promise in the furthered understanding of pesticide usage as well as the long-term impacts. While significant research has already been done, the one thing that all of the reviews and studies had in common was the need for further research. Now that we have confirmed many of the claims of long-term soil and water contamination, bioaccumulation, and biomagnification, we must concentrate on where to go next. Determining more of the impacts on physiological and biochemical processes from pesticide exposure will likely help us to determine if there are connections to developmental and late-life diseases, as in the work of Goncalves et al. And Kochmansky et al. In addition, a law review conducted by Daniel Muller in 2019 outlined that pesticide usage has not decreased since the 1960s, but in fact has increased due to the necessity to increase agricultural outputs. The information contained in Muller's law review outlines the necessity for pesticide impact modeling and research into alternative pesticides, as is being conducted by Aslam et al. And Dominguez and Santos. Muller's law review further explained that while significant progress has been made in the regulation and monitoring since the times of Silent Spring, there is still much that is lacking. Muller urges for change that includes increasing the accountability of both synthetic chemical manufacturers as well as farmers utilizing the products. In conclusion, Rachel Carson very bravely raised the warning flag and refused to sit idly by. The themes discussed throughout Silent Spring, as well as current research, shows us that there can be devastating and long-term impacts from the utilization of synthetic chemicals for pesticides. Still to this day, we must take a step back and look at the totality of costs in economic, ecological, and ethical currencies and determine if the benefits are worth it. Fundamentally, we need to reconsider what we believe are pests and how to handle them to ensure a world worth living in can endure. Thank you, and please let me know if you have any questions.